The sound of that strike still ricochets inside my skull like a hammer dropped in an empty church. It wasn't only the blow itself that froze every fork midair, it was what followed. A silence, so thick it felt like a curtain falling on a play no one wanted to watch. We were gathered for what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday supper when my son-in-law, Adrian, eyes narrowed with a fury that seemed older than the argument that caused it, stood from his chair and slapped my daughter Clara across the face. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you were listening in the comments. His hand moved with such practiced certainty that, for a second, I wondered how many times he had raised it when I wasn't there to witness it. I saw Clara's head whip to the side. I saw the shock flicker across her face like a candle robbed of its flame. And then, the moment that told me something deeper, darker, had been festering behind the walls of their home. Adrian's mother, Marjorie, sitting at his right, let out a single satisfied clap. Just one. Sharp. As if she were congratulating him for correcting a mistake. That sound, that little sound, felt more violent than the slap. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply lifted a hand to her cheek and stared at the floor as if her soul were retreating inside her, hiding in some corner where even she could not reach it. I rose slowly from my seat. No yelling, no dishes thrown, no shaking hands. My body burned with rage, but my voice, when it finally came, was steady, almost frighteningly calm. I looked around the table at the guests who pretended their plates were suddenly fascinating, at the relatives who had seen the signs for years and said nothing, at the man who still breathed like a storm, waiting for permission to break again, at the woman who applauded cruelty as though she had been waiting for it. Without a single word, I took my old phone from my jacket and dialed a number I had sworn I would never call again. As it rang, Marjorie smirked. "That girl should know better than to answer him back," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Still, no one moved. No one defended my daughter. The air smelled of roasted chicken, warm bread, and cowardice. I hung up the phone, tucked it gently into my pocket, and said only one sentence. "No one leaves this house." A few of them scoffed. Adrian even laughed, a cold, hollow laugh of a man certain he owned every person in that room. But none of them knew what I had set in motion. Adrian's mocking smile still hung crooked on his face when the doorknob at the front of the house began to turn. At first, the soft metallic click barely registered among the tension. But for me, it split the air like a warning bell. Clara's breath hitched. Marjorie's grin faltered, and Adrian's swagger evaporated in a single heartbeat. The door eased open, not rushed, not chaotic, but with the controlled certainty of people who walk into darkness for a living. Two officers stepped inside, followed by a woman in a charcoal suit whose stern calm felt heavier than any uniform. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their presence alone rewrote the room. "Sir," one of the officers said, eyes sweeping across every face, "we received a live call reporting domestic violence." The word violence dropped like a stone into the silence. Adrian straightened in his seat. "Now hold on, this is Dash." But for the first time in years, maybe ever, Clara spoke before he could. Her voice cracked at the edges, fragile but unmistakably real. "Yes," she whispered. "He hit me." My chest loosened with something between agony and relief. A truth that had been locked away behind closed doors had finally stepped into the light. Marjorie shot up from her chair with the indignation of a queen whose crown had been questioned. "This is absurd," she barked. My son was simply correcting her. "That girl has a tongue like a razor, and someone needs to keep her in line." The officer nearest to her raised a hand, unmoved. "Ma'am, step back." She tried to move toward Clara again, not to comfort her, but to scold her, to tower over her, to reassert the dominance she had worn like perfume for years. The officer's arm cut her off sharply. "That is close enough." Clara finally broke. The tears she had swallowed for seasons came pouring out, not loudly, but in a long, trembling release. The cry of someone who has spent too long pretending not to feel pain. The woman in the charcoal suit approached her, draping a soft shawl over her shoulders. She spoke gently, bending to Clara's eye level, giving her a kind of comfort I wish I had offered sooner. I, at my age, past 60 and walking into the late years of my life, realized something shameful. Silence can wound too. Silence can be a slow, cruel accomplice. The officers moved to restrain Adrian. He spat, shouted, hurled accusations at the air, at Clara, at me. This is a setup, a damn conspiracy. She's manipulating all of you. But the red mark blooming across my daughter's cheek spoke louder than any of his excuses. No one in the room believed him. Marjorie tried to lunge after her son when the officers asked her to remain seated, but she was held back. Her cries were not cries of remorse. They were the panic howls of someone watching control slip through her fingers. One of the officers turned to me. "Sir, were you the one who made the call?" I nodded. "Yes," I said quietly, "and I should have made it years earlier." He asked if I was willing to give a statement later. I agreed. As Adrian was questioned in the hallway, Clara suddenly collapsed to her knees in front of me, her hands trembling violently. "Dad, I'm so sorry." "For what?" I whispered. "For not telling you." Wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. It was the first fissure in a much larger truth. One that, once it began to crack open, would expose far more than a single act of violence. This was merely the beginning. The house emptied slowly after the officers left, as though fear itself took time to detach from every corner. The neighbors across the street peeked from behind curtains, pretending they weren't hungry for a story they had sensed for years but never dared to name. Inside, the remnants of dinner were still steaming slightly, untouched. Adrian's empty chair stood like a bruise on the room. One of the officers returned briefly, notebook in hand, and asked me to recount the events calmly. I spoke with a heaviness that felt older than my bones, describing the moment Adrian's anger boiled over, the slap, Marjorie's disturbing applause, the suffocating silence that followed. Every word felt like pulling stones from my chest. The officer scribbled, nodding with the practiced patience of someone who has heard too many variations of the same tragedy. Meanwhile, the woman in the charcoal suit sat with Clara on the living room couch. She spoke to her with remarkable gentleness, giving her the space to breathe between sentences. For the first time in far too long, my daughter was speaking without fear of being interrupted or contradicted. I watched from the doorway, a knot tightening in my throat. Why had it taken strangers in uniforms for her to finally be heard? When the officers left, Marjorie was escorted out as well. Not arrested, not yet, but warned that her behavior would be documented. She hissed in my direction like a cornered animal before disappearing into the night. The door closed, and the house became painfully still. Clara sat at the sofa's edge, folded into herself, rubbing her arms as though trying to warm a body chilled by years rather than minutes. I brought her a blanket, placing it over her shoulders without saying anything. "Dad," she whispered finally. "I never thought anyone would come." My heart clenched. "They came tonight," I answered, "and I'm not leaving you alone again." Her eyes brimmed with tears that didn't fall, tears that seemed too tired to travel anymore. The weight of all her unspoken years pressed invisibly into the room. After some time, we moved to the small kitchen. The air felt thick with the scent of overcooked vegetables and something else, the aftertaste of a life unraveling. Clara sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The steam rose slowly, like courage trying to find its way back into her lungs. But then her phone buzzed. She stiffened. Her fingers trembled before she managed to turn it over. A message from Marjorie. I leaned slightly to see the screen. Words dripping with venom, disguised as righteousness. Accusations. Threats. Twisted guilt. You will regret what you did tonight. You brought shame to this family. You always provoke him. Clara turned the phone face down as if it burned her skin. It was always like this, she murmured. Every time something happened, she said I deserved it. A heat rose up inside me. Slow, simmering, dangerous. No one deserves to be hit, I said, my voice low. No one deserves to be corrected with violence. She looked at me, really looked at me, with the fragile, tentative gaze of someone relearning what safety feels like. That was when the doorbell rang. The chime sliced through the house like a blade. Clara flinched so violently that the tea spilled onto her hand. I reached for a towel, my own pulse suddenly thundering. But when I opened the door, it wasn't officers. It was a young man, thin, nervous, carrying an anxious slump to his shoulders. Daniel, Adrian's younger brother. He avoided my eyes, wringing his hands. I just came to pick up some of Adrian's things, he muttered. He'll need clothes for tonight at the station. Not tonight, I said firmly, blocking the doorway. Tomorrow at earliest. No one else comes inside this house. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded, almost relieved I had refused him. He backed away into the shadows without a fight. I locked the door, every bolt, every latch. When I turned, Clara was watching me from the hallway, her voice barely a breath. Dad, they always protected him. Always. Not anymore, I told her. Tonight that ends. We sat together in the living room as the hours crept by. The world outside slowly settled. Inside, the walls seemed to hold their breath. Clara didn't sleep. Neither did I. In the quiet that followed, I felt the truth settle heavily on my shoulders. The slap was not a beginning. It was a revelation. And the real story, the one that had been brewing behind closed doors for years, hadn't even begun to surface yet. Dawn had not yet touched the sky when Clara finally spoke again. The house was dim, the only light coming from the old lamp in the corner, the same one her mother bought decades ago, insisting the warm glow made rooms feel safer. Back then, I never understood the need for such comfort, but tonight the lamp felt like a fragile companion against the dark. Clara rubbed her temples slowly. Dad, she said, her voice brittle. It didn't start today. I froze, not surprised, but devastated all the same. I sat beside her, keeping my silence steady, giving her room to breathe. The first time wasn't a slap, she whispered. It was a push. Right after we got married. We were arguing about money. He shoved me against the wall. I thought it was stress, or just a mistake. She gave a humorless laugh. Funny, isn't it? How easily we explain away the first sin. I felt something inside me twist. Why hadn't I seen? Why hadn't I suspected? Why did I accept smiles that looked like masks? He apologized afterward, she continued. He cried, promised it would never happen again. And I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that I had made a good choice. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, a small, trembling motion that betrayed how deeply her memories cut. But then came the insults, she said. Quiet insults. Ones no one else could hear. Ones that burrow under your skin like splinters. You're useless. No one else would put up with you. You're lucky I even bothered with you. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. And then his mother, she whispered, as if naming a curse. Always there. Always watching. Always justifying him. She told me a man is respected when he is feared. She said I should learn to obey. That I was dramatic, difficult, ungrateful. I pressed my hand to my forehead, feeling a flush of heat surge behind my eyes. I had suspected Marjorie's coldness, but never the extent of it. Never the poison she poured into my daughter's life. When I had bruises, Clara said, I'd tell you and others that I fell. And everyone believed me. She looked up at me with a grief so old it seemed fossilized. You believe me. Her words landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through memories I didn't want to revisit, Memories of long sleeves in summer, canceled plans, nervous smiles. Signs I should have read. I wanted to ask you, I said quietly, but I didn't want to hurt you. That's the irony, she murmured. The silence hurt more than the truth would have. She took a breath, shaky but determined. One night, he kicked me. Hard. I locked myself in the bathroom until sunrise. His mother was there too. She watched. The room seemed to shrink. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. But Dad, she continued, the worst part wasn't the violence. It was believing I somehow caused it, that I deserved it, that maybe if I behaved better it would stop. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. You never deserved any of it. Not a single push. Not a single insult. She closed her eyes. Tears didn't fall. She had cried all she had. When you call the authorities tonight, she said softly, I realized something. I realized I didn't even know how much danger I was in until someone else showed me. Her words settled over us like dust on old furniture, heavy, undeniable. We walked outside for a few minutes, needing air. The neighborhood was waking up slowly, unaware of the storm inside our home. A dog barked in the distance. A car engine sputtered to life. Ordinary sounds in the aftermath of an extraordinary night. Clara looked up at the pale morning sky. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I admitted. But fear doesn't make us prisoners anymore. Not today. When we returned inside, something had shifted, small, fragile, but real. The first thread of courage had woven itself into her voice. But it was only the start. The truth she had shared was just one layer, and deeper layers still waited in the dark, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to redefine everything we thought we knew about Adrian, Marjorie, and the world my daughter had lived in. The nightmare had not ended. It had simply changed shape. I had always believed the hardest part of justice was the courtroom. I was wrong. The hardest part was the slow, patient work of gathering proof, of turning whispers and bruises into a map that a judge could read. The morning after the arrests, a social worker came by with a stack of pamphlets and a softness in her voice that seemed to know the exact decibel of pain a person could bear. She sat on the edge of the sofa and listened while Clara talked, and then she asked permission to make a phone call to connect us with someone who could help. I nodded. I had reached the age where saying yes felt like the right thing to do more often than not. That afternoon, an old number I had kept in a drawer for emergencies rang my phone. It was a voice I had not heard in years. Low, careful, professional. Mr. Alvarez? He asked. My name is Mateo. I handle sensitive investigations. I received an anonymous tip linking Adrian to illicit money movements. If you're Gonzalo, I can help. The name landed oddly. I felt both exposed and oddly relieved. I told him what little I knew. He told me to prepare everything we had. I gathered the things that had always seemed like fragments. Late-night transfer receipts that I had paid without questioning, odd cash withdrawals, messages Clara had saved and hidden under her pillow. There were receipts for transfers of sums that should have been impossible to explain quietly. Sums like $30,000 and $40,000 that I had once shrugged off as loans for bills or repairs. They were larger than I remembered seeing, and the pattern in them made my stomach twist. Mateo came by that evening with a discreet case and a face that betrayed both fatigue and fierce concentration. He listened, asked intelligent questions, and then did something I had not expected. He slid a small recorder onto the table and said, "Has she ever recorded him?" Clara looked at me as if asking permission with her eyes. I nodded. She had indeed hidden recordings, small audio files kept on a dusty voice memo app she rarely opened. She had been saving them, she told us later, in a pocket of courage she did not know she possessed. She feared him finding them, so she kept them locked away in case one day she needed proof. We listened that night in the living room with the blinds drawn. The audio was grainy, a voice raised, a chair scraping the floor, the unmistakable sound of something striking flesh. Then the low, mocking laugh of a woman who had learned to celebrate domination. I felt nausea wash through me, not at the sound, but at the revelation that the applause I had heard at the table was only a fraction of the cruelty. Mateo took the files with a solemn nod. "This will change everything," he said. "But we must be careful. People who profit from fear rarely surrender quietly. That phrase settled in my chest like another stone. In the next few days, Mateo's investigation unearthed more. Bank transfers tied to anonymous shell accounts. Messages from suspected associates asking for collections and promising protection, and a pattern of small, regular payments that read less like household help and more like a systematic extraction of resources from vulnerable people. Clara had, unwittingly, been the village that sustained their facade. They had used intimidation and fear to justify funds moving in and out of accounts. And, on the surface, it had always looked like family loans repaid in crumpled envelopes. As we cataloged documents, I realized how many times I had been used as a lever to move cash without really asking what it was for. I had handed over $20,000 once for a supposed emergency loan, convinced by a solemn face. I had paid for days in hospital for supposed debts, for things I never had proof existed. Now each transaction felt like a bruise on our household finances and on my conscience. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that the slap at the dinner table had not been an isolated cruelty. It was the final hiccup of a machine built to control, through fear, through money, through humiliation. These people had constructed a life where violence and revenue fed each other. When Mateo presented his preliminary report to the prosecutor, the way the man's eyes shifted made me understand that this might not be simply a domestic case anymore. It had the smell of something far larger, and with it came a fear I had not felt, that the tentacles of their operation reached further than just our street. That evening, after the prosecutor took notes and frowned more than once, Clara turned to me and said, in a voice small but certain, "You called them, Dad. You started it." I took her hand and squeezed it. The truth felt heavy, but it also felt like the first honest thing I had done in a long time. The path ahead would be long and dangerous. The noise of the upcoming battle had begun, but at least now we had a map. The days that followed were a blur of official letters, guarded conversations, and the peculiar intimacy that forms between people who have watched a life unravel. The prosecutor called with a calm that barely hid the urgency beneath. "We have enough to request preventive detention for the mother as well," he said. "There is evidence of concealment and complicity." When I hung up, my hands trembled in a way they hadn't since my heart surgery years ago. I thought of Clara sitting at the kitchen table that morning, fingering a court summons like it might dissolve beneath her touch. The idea that the woman who had once applauded a blow would now be compelled to answer for it felt surreal, like someone splicing daylight into a room that had known only dusk. Word moved faster than I expected. By the time officers arrived at Marjorie's house that afternoon, the street had gathered itself into a small audience. People who had pretended not to notice now peered from windows and doorways, eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and guilt. Some offered nervous smiles as we passed. Others looked away as if ashamed. When they let her out in handcuffs, she screamed my name, accusing the world of injustice. The neighbors watched in a hush that felt almost reverent. The power that had once cast a long, opaque shadow was shrinking under the light of truth. But the fall of one pillar only wrenched others to rattle. That very evening, an envelope appeared on our porch. No stamp, no return address. Only a single sheet of paper with hurried handwriting. "If you keep talking, you will regret it." Clara held the note with hands that barely seemed like hers. She didn't cry. She folded it and placed it carefully into a folder I had labeled evidence. Each threat, each petty intimidation, was now another thread we could show the prosecutor. Still, the message left a cold taste in my mouth. I had expected fear from them, but not this brazen insolence. Their desperation was a dangerous thing. The press smelled the story and began to circle like gulls. A local reporter called asking for comments, for pictures, for a line that would make the cameras turn. I refused. Clara refused. The prosecutor asked us to avoid public statements. He was right. The fewer flaming torches we fed, the better. Security measures followed. We swapped phone numbers, changed locks, and notified 2 trusted neighbors to keep an eye on the house. I installed an extra bolt on the back door with trembling fingers. It felt almost childish, a latch against a world that had teeth. But small things can be shields too. Through it all, Matteo continued his work quietly. He unearthed more transfers, messages, and suspicious contracts. Every document expanded the map of their network. Adrian, it turned out, had been a cog, not the whole machine. And the more we peeled back, the more names surfaced. The scope made my head ache. Then came a message from an unknown number. A voice, disguised and cautious, offered to meet. It was one of Adrian's associates, or perhaps someone else caught in the net. He wanted protection in exchange for testimony. It was the same pattern Matteo had warned us about. Once a crack appears, others seek cover by telling the truth. We met in a crowded cafe where the ambient noise was its own kind of safety. The man, gaunt, tired, pushed a USB drive across the table with hands that shook. "Everything's in there," he whispered. "Names, transfers, voices." I felt both terrified and oddly relieved. The web they had woven was wider than I imagined. But with witnesses like this, the prosecutor's case would harden into something durable. At night, however, sleep was a stranger. The house creaked with imagined footsteps. Clara would wake from nightmares, eyes wild, asking if the noise outside was real. Each time I reassured her, I felt a fierce resolve building inside me that had nothing to do with law books or courtrooms. It was about keeping a promise. I called. I reminded her once in a voice that tried not to shake. "And I will keep calling until the truth is heard." She gripped my hand, nails white against the skin. "Don't ever do it alone again," she said. I nodded. Outside, the neighborhood was changing in strange, halting ways. People who had kept their distance now brought food, small gestures that felt like apologies. Others pecked at the edges, curious, excited at the spectacle of a facade collapsing. But the threats remained, and so did the danger. The war had widened, and somewhere in the dark, those who profited from silence were sharpening their claws. The following days carried a heaviness that clung to the walls like humidity. Every knock on the door, every phone vibrating on the counter, every shadow passing by the window made Clara tense, shoulders rising as if bracing for an invisible blow. It was the muscle memory of fear, the kind that doesn't ask permission before returning. The prosecutor called again. "Mr. Alvarez," he said, "your son-in-law has begun negotiating." That sentence chilled me more than any threat letter. When men like him feel cornered, the prosecutor continued, they often try to trade information for leniency. But he doesn't fully understand how much evidence we already have. "What is he offering?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Names, locations, money routes." And he paused long enough that I leaned forward in my chair. "And details about how his mother helped intimidate witnesses in at least 3 other cases." 3, not 1, not 2. 3 other people had suffered under the same shadow my daughter had lived beneath. And like her, they had stayed quiet. The weight of that knowledge pressed into my chest like a stone. Clara sat across from me at the kitchen table while I spoke on the phone. Her eyes narrowed, suspicious, fearful, alert. When I hung up, she looked at me as though trying to read the verdict on my face. "What now?" she whispered. "Now," I said softly, "we prepare for whatever comes next." But next arrived sooner than either of us expected. That afternoon, the man who had given us the USB drive called Matteo in a panic. He claimed someone had followed him, someone not from the police. His voice trembled as he asked whether turning over evidence had been a mistake. "It's always dangerous when the truth starts leaking," Matteo told us after hanging up. "Criminal networks don't collapse quietly. They fight on their way down." The thought made my stomach twist. Not for myself, at my age, death didn't frighten me much anymore. But for Clara. She stood by the living room window that evening, arms wrapped around herself, staring out as if the street might reveal something hidden. Streetlights flickered. A dog barked. A car rolled slowly past before turning the corner. It was nothing unusual. And yet, tonight, everything felt like a message. "Dad," Clara murmured. "What if Adrian tries something before the trial? What if he finds a way?" I walked to her side, steadier than I felt. "He won't," I said. "And if he tries, there are consequences waiting for him now." But consequences never stopped him before. That's because they were never real. I replied. Now they are. She swallowed hard. Her hand tightened on the curtain. Later that night, another call came, this time from Mateo. Gonzalo, he said, I need you to be cautious. Adrian is showing signs of desperation. When men who control through fear lose their grip, they can become volatile. He took a deep breath. And there's something else. There are rumors he may try to silence someone before the indictment is finalized. Do you mean Clara? Yes. My heart thudded painfully, like an old motor starting to fail. We'll stay vigilant, I said, my voice firm despite the tremor under it. After we ended the call, I reinforced every lock in the house again. I checked the windows twice. I turned on the porch lights and drew the curtains tightly. Clara watched me from the hallway. Seeing her standing there, fragile yet resilient, I felt something age inside me. A quiet acceptance that I was willing to become a wall if that's what it took to shield her. Dad, she whispered, I'm tired of being afraid. I walked to her and placed my hands gently on her shoulders. Fear can't rule anymore, I said, not with the truth finally on our side. She nodded slowly. And yet, even with the evidence mounting, even with Marjorie in custody and the network unraveling piece by piece, I sensed that the storm had not finished with us. Storms rarely pass cleanly. They claw and thrash on their way out, leaving debris behind. And somewhere out there, I knew Adrian was realizing just how completely his world was collapsing. Men like him don't surrender quietly. They strike back. The night after Mateo's warning, the house felt like a drum. Every quiet sound amplified, every distant footstep a forewarning. Sleep was a thin, fragile thing we both pretended to embrace out of sheer exhaustion. But when Clara shifted in her bed, I was awake, listening for the scrape of a shoe on the gravel or the whisper of a voice beneath the window. Within 48 hours, a string of small but unnerving events began to knot together. A smashed mailbox 2 houses down. A silhouette at the far edge of the garden that vanished when the porch light came on. A single tire mark in the dust by the alley gate that had not been there in the morning. They were the petty tactics of frightened people who still believed they had teeth. Then the first direct warning arrived. A photograph slipped through our letterbox with no envelope, just a single glossy image showing Clara stepping out of the supermarket 2 weeks earlier. Someone had taken it from a distance, a silent watcher maintaining a catalog of our movements. On the back, a scribbled line, "We see you." Clara did not scream. She folded the picture carefully and put it in the evidence folder. She was more composed than I felt, but her hands betrayed her with a slight tremor. The next day, a neighbor, Mrs. Rios, the widow who lived 2 doors down and who had always been shy, knocked gently and left a plastic bag of soup. She stayed a moment longer than usual, eyes wet. "If you need anything," she whispered, "call me. I can watch the back gate if you want." Her voice was small, but the offer felt enormous. Allies appeared in odd places. A retired accountant from the corner grocery called to say he had seen suspicious cash movements coming through a local cash-for-goods van. A young woman from the laundromat returned a misplaced receipt that, when Mateo checked it, referenced a payee name now on our growing list of suspicious transfers. Each tiny piece of information had once been meaningless. Now, stitched together, they formed a net. One afternoon, Mateo rang me and said something I had been hoping for in a half-prayer. "They've recorded conversations implicating at least one more accomplice," he said. "And Adrian, he's talking. He's offering names to reduce his exposure." The relief I felt was immediate and guilty. Immediate because it strengthened our case, guilty because someone was bargaining to save themselves by selling others out. It was the kind of moral compromise that makes your stomach ache. Adrian's bargaining meant one thing. His arrogance had been broken. Men who thought themselves untouchable started to see the walls closing in. And when walls close, some crawl and some strike. That evening, a frantic call came from Mateo. "Gonzalo, an associate who promised to testify, says he's being followed. He wants protection now." Mateo's voice was clipped. "He's ready to give detailed bank routes, but he refuses to meet unless we can guarantee safety." We met in a police station parking lot under the cautious gray light of late afternoon. The man, heavy-eyed, hands rubbed raw from nerves, handed a notebook with names and dates. He spoke of collection rounds, of envelopes handed over in corners, of threats whispered over phone calls. He gave us records, old receipts, and a map of who handled what. When he left with an officer, I felt both relief and a new worry. The more we exposed, the more dangerous it would become. The prosecutor, sensing the momentum, accelerated moves we thought might take months. An order to freeze some bank accounts was filed. An application to seize properties connected to the alleged ring was prepared. The press, still sniffing, began to circle in a more restrained manner. Careful inquiries rather than the hungry flashes of cameras. Clara, meanwhile, began to change in small but meaningful ways. She walked farther in the mornings, went to the pharmacy alone, returned with small purchases like a new notebook or a plant for the windowsill. These were tiny acts, a few steps reclaimed at a time, but each one tested the muscle of freedom. I watched her from the kitchen doorway and felt both pride and an ache for the years taken from her. Not every night was tense. There were moments that felt almost normal. A neighbor's child delivering a jar of homemade jam. An afternoon when the three of us, Mateo included, sat at the kitchen table, comparing notes like weary conspirators. Laughter surfaced sometimes, small and brittle, but genuine. And yet danger remained real. One evening the phone rang, and Mateo's voice was raw with warning. "They're trying to discredit some of our witnesses," he said. "Planting stories in small papers. Calling old contacts. Don't engage with reporters." I replied, "We won't. We'll keep to the path. Truth builds its own armor." The network was crumbling, strand by strand. The claws that had once held Clara in place were loosening. But as they did, they scraped the skin, leaving marks that would take time to heal. Nights have a way of stretching when danger lives in their corners. The air feels thicker, the smallest sounds amplified, as if darkness itself leans closer to listen. By the time midnight came around that week, Clara had fallen into an uneasy sleep, curled on the sofa beneath a knitted blanket. I remained awake, sitting in my armchair with the lamp off, watching the moonlight spill across the rug in soft, trembling patches. Everything in me felt taut, like a thread stretched between two worlds, the one we had survived and the one still trying to claw its way back. Then, sometime after 2 in the morning, a knock at the door. Not a polite tap, a violent, fist-cracking blow that rattled the wood. Clara jerked awake with a cry, scrambling upright, eyes wide and unfocused with terror. Another blow, harder, a sound filled with rage and entitlement, something feral. I rose slowly, every muscle resisting, every instinct screaming to push Clara behind me. I gestured for her to stay back. Her breathing was ragged, panicked. Then came the voice. A voice I would recognize even if years had passed. "Adrian!" He shouted Clara's name, slurring with anger, desperation, and what sounded like alcohol. The sound cut through the house like a knife dragged against glass. "Open this door. Clara, do you hear me?" A fist slammed again. "You think you can do this to me? You think dash." I didn't wait to hear more. My fingers dialed the emergency line without hesitation. "This is Gonzalo Alvarez," I said sharply. "The man detained for domestic violence is at my house right now. He is threatening us. Send officers immediately." The dispatcher responded with urgency. "Stay inside, sir. Do not engage. Units are on the way." I set the phone down and turned toward the door again. Adrian's fury was escalating. He kicked the bottom panel, cracking the wood slightly. Clara sobbed silently, hands over her mouth. "Cowards," he roared. "Open up. I know she's in there." I did not speak. Silence was my shield. Moments later, though it felt like hours, sirens began echoing down the street. Blue and red light danced in the window glass. Adrian's shouting faltered as he stepped back from the door. He tried to flee, stumbling backward, but the wet pavement betrayed him. He slipped, collapsing onto his knees just as officers rushed toward him. They barked orders he ignored. He tried to stand, but hands forced him down. The crackle of a taser threatened the air, but the officers controlled him with practiced precision before it came to that. From the window, I watched the man who had once terrified my daughter reduced to a shaking silhouette under emergency lights. His cries turned from rage into incoherent babble. Accusations, pleas, curses. None of them landed anywhere. They drifted into the night like ash. Clara stood behind me, her hands trembling against my back. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She simply watched, her breath uneven but steadying. I looked at her face and realized something had shifted, not in him, not in the world, but in her. Fear was loosening its grip. The officers placed Adrian in the back of the patrol car. One of them approached our door to check on us. "Are you both safe?" he asked. I nodded. "We are now," Clara whispered. "Thank you," though her voice barely carried. As the car drove away, the neighborhood woke again with curious whispers behind curtains. But this time, it wasn't Clara being scrutinized through rumors and judgment. It was him. For the first time in years, fear did not belong to her. It belonged to the man in handcuffs, screaming into the void as his world collapsed around him. Inside the house, Clara sank onto the sofa, exhausted, trembling from adrenaline. I sat beside her, feeling the ache in my bones and the sharp, hollow echo of relief. "It's over," she whispered. "No," I said softly, placing a hand on hers. "But tonight, a door closed that will never open again." And I meant it. The sun rose quietly the next morning, as if afraid to disturb what remained of the night. Light crept through the curtains in thin, hesitant lines, touching the room where Clara and I sat with cups of untouched coffee cooling in our hands. Neither of us had slept. Our eyes were swollen, our thoughts tangled, our bodies weighed down by a fatigue that was more emotional than physical. Clara stared into her mug, the steam long gone. "Dad," she murmured, her voice frayed. "Can he really not come back?" It wasn't a question about legalities. It was the plea of someone whose soul had been held hostage for years. "He cannot come back," I answered. "And even if the world flipped upside down and he stood at this door again, he would never gain entry into your life." She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the shape of freedom on her tongue. For the first time, her shoulders lowered by a fraction. Not relaxation, just a slight release of tension. Soon after, calls began flooding my phone one after another. A neighbor offering support. The prosecutor confirming Adrian's immediate redetention. A social worker asking if Clara needed medical attention or a counselor. It was as though the entire world that had been blind or indifferent for so long suddenly remembered she existed. Another call came from the prosecutor's office. "Mr. Alvarez," he said, "we have officially denied any appeal for temporary release. The charges are too serious, and the attempted intimidation last night reinforces the danger." Clara heard him through the speaker. When the call ended, she closed her eyes. A tremor ran through her, not fear this time, but overwhelming relief. A few neighbors stopped by later, tiptoeing with gentle caution. One brought bread, another delivered coffee beans. A third offered a small bouquet of wildflowers from her garden. Their gestures were clumsy, but sincere. Small attempts to acknowledge that they had seen something horrifying and had done nothing for too long. Clara accepted each gift with a soft smile. Her voice was still delicate, but there was a new steadiness beneath it. By early afternoon, the prosecutor summoned us again to give expanded statements. We walked into the building with slow steps. The corridors buzzed with whispers, lawyers carrying stacks of folders, clerks shuffling between offices. When Clara's turn came, she stood taller than I expected. I waited in the hall as she entered a room with a glass panel. Through it, I watched her speak, sometimes with shaking hands, sometimes with long pauses, sometimes with a quivering voice. But she did not back down. She did not shy away. She told them everything with the clarity of someone who had decided to stop hiding from her own truth. When she exited the room, her eyes were red but not defeated. "Dad," she said quietly, "I said everything. All of it. That's enough," I told her. More than enough. On the ride home, she leaned her head against the window, watching the city move by. People walking dogs, children running with backpacks, shopkeepers pulling down awnings. Ordinary life, continuing in a world where her life had been anything but ordinary. Once home, she walked slowly through the hallway, pausing near the kitchen table. "This," she whispered, touching the back of a chair, "is where he hit me the last time." I stepped beside her, and this is where it ended. Later, as evening settled, she picked up a pen and a notebook, a new one she had bought days earlier but hadn't opened. She wrote a single line at the top of the first page. "I survived last night." She stared at the words for a long time, then closed the notebook gently, almost lovingly. "Dad," she said, her voice softer than the room's quiet. I think I'm finally breathing." I nodded, unable to find words. For months, for years, her life had been dominated by a single shadow. But that shadow had been dragged into the light, and though its outlines still lingered, it no longer had the density to suffocate her. The storm had broken. The night had been survived, and in its wake, dawn had come bearing a truth neither of us dared believe would ever arrive. Freedom does not always come loudly. Sometimes it begins with a single breath you're no longer afraid to take. Once the system finally moved, it did so with a force and speed I had not expected. For years, it had seemed immovable, a wall too dense to crack, too indifferent to care. But once the first fissure appeared, everything beneath it shifted. The prosecutor's office now carried the momentum. And with each passing day, the files on their desks grew heavier, denser, more difficult for anyone to wave away as misunderstanding or exaggeration. Evidence arrived not in drips, but in small floods. Testimony, documents, and the strange detritus of secret wrongdoing accumulated almost faster than we could read it. What terrified me most was not what Adrian and the others had done, but how many people had been swallowed by the same shadow without ever raising an alarm. How many had lived at the edge of something sinister and never found the breath to speak. And how many, even now, were deciding whether to stay silent or emerge. Only a week after the arrest, the phone in our kitchen began ringing with unfamiliar numbers. The first call was from a woman whose voice trembled so much I had to hold the receiver tightly, as if my steadiness could be transmitted through the wire. She said she had seen something important months earlier, packages exchanged in a parking lot, conversations that stopped the moment she stepped into view. She had convinced herself it was none of her business, but now, hearing what had come to light, she knew she could no longer say nothing. After it came more. People who had once been silent now spoke in low, hurried tones, afraid of retribution but compelled by conscience. One by one, they offered small but sharp pieces of a much larger puzzle. A neighbor who recalled a man handing over sealed envelopes at dusk, a former tenant who remembered threats whispered across a stairwell, a cashier who said a series of odd cash payments had been made at a register over months, always by different people, always with the same glazed, fearful expression. Each new testimony felt like a key turning in a lock I had not even realized existed. The larger mechanism, whatever structure these men had built, slowly revealed itself, one metallic click at a time. That afternoon, Mateo arrived carrying another folder, thicker than any before. Inside were transcriptions of intercepted calls, bank statements showing long-term withdrawals far too consistent to be accidental, and notes from a man who had once worked for them. This man, living in a neighboring town under a different name, now wanted to undo what he had helped build. His handwriting shook on the page. The weight of regret was visible even in the ink. The scale of it all was larger than anything I had dared imagine. The more we read, the clearer the pattern became. Pressure placed on other victims to stay quiet, intimidation campaigns against those who attempted to file complaints, and a chilling phrase repeated across messages like a brand stamped into flesh. "You will learn to be quiet." When the prosecutor reviewed everything, his face shifted, not toward uncertainty, but toward a grim and resolute focus, a tightening of purpose I both welcomed and feared. "We can expand the indictment," he said at last. "This is no longer only about domestic violence. There are elements of extortion, money laundering, organized intimidation. This is a network, and we need to treat it as one." The words landed with the gravity of an earthquake. Charges multiplied into consequences. Consequences multiplied into the possibility, for the first time, of real accountability. The ripple effects came quickly. Adrian, sensing the walls closing around him, began negotiating to trade names for leniency. It started tentatively, like a man dipping a toe into water he feared might burn him. But soon it turned into a flurry of revelations. He pointed toward accomplices, financiers, men who had offered protection, men who had issued threats on his behalf, and others who had profited from the silence of victims. Some names meant nothing to me. Others struck like cold knives. People I had seen around town for years, men who exchanged polite greetings at the market, who had children in local schools, who belonged to community groups, were suddenly implicated in a darkness I had never suspected. With every name Adrian mentioned, the prosecutor's office sent out new summonses, called new witnesses, and added new files to the ever-growing stack on Mateo's desk. The list of accused began to swell, threatening to stretch beyond the confines of our community. Clara listened to all this with an expression braided from too many emotions to untangle easily. Relief, certainly, relief that the truth was finally emerging, but also unease. A widening net meant more possible enemies, more unpredictable retaliation. "Is it better that it's so big?" she asked one evening as we sat at the table after dinner. The plates had been cleared, but neither of us had moved. "That more people are implicated, I mean. It is better that the truth is whole," I answered. "Partial justice protects partial criminals. A full truth, even if painful, has a better chance at lasting." She nodded slowly, chewing at her thumbnail. I saw the calculation in her eyes. Each name exposed meant fewer shadows for cruelty to hide in, but also more people who might lash out as their secrets unraveled. Meanwhile, the press grew more insistent. Reporters called our home repeatedly, wanting statements, details, reactions. Cameras appeared on the sidewalk at odd hours. The gossip that had once wrapped itself around our block like ivy, persistent, invasive, now began to fray under the weight of legal facts. Speculation no longer had the same oxygen it once did. We refused every interview. The prosecutor insisted on controlled disclosures. He feared that a misphrased comment or a sensational headline could compromise the case. "The courtroom," he reminded us, "will be the place for truth, not the tabloids." So we stayed quiet and endured the clicking cameras through closed blinds. Inside our home, we tried to create an island of normalcy. Clara brought home a potted plant, a sturdy little thing with deep green leaves, and placed it on the windowsill. It seemed a quiet act of defiance. Life, contained in a small pot, insisting on being seen despite everything collapsing around us. We cooked simple dinners. We spoke about mundane things, the weather, a book one of us was reading, the oddity of the neighborhood cat who had started visiting our porch without invitation. Sometimes we even allowed silence to settle between us, but unlike before, that silence no longer felt sharp. It did not accuse. It simply existed, breathing alongside us. And yet, there were nights I woke abruptly, heart pounding, dragged out of sleep by the memory of that clap in the dining room. The small, decisive sound that had once signaled the acceptance of cruelty. The memory surged up like an old bruise pressed too hard. On those nights, I found myself walking to the front window, staring out at the streetlights, watching the world shift slowly toward dawn. The house would be quiet, the air unmoving, and I would stand there feeling both ancient and newly awakened. 68 years old, and suddenly navigating a war I hadn't realized had been happening around me for decades. But the world, however slowly, however unevenly, had begun to turn its face toward the truth. That turn altered the weight of life for many of us. Not kindly for all, not evenly, but undeniably. The direction was different now. Something had shifted. For the first time in many years, it felt as though something larger than fear might prevail. The following week felt like walking through the ashes of a long-burning fire, the kind that consumes quietly for years before anyone notices the smoke. Everywhere I looked, there were remnants of something that had once held power, now reduced to brittle fragments. The town felt different too, as if the unspoken fear that had long knotted its streets was beginning to loosen, thread by delicate thread. The prosecutor called us almost daily. Each conversation carried more certainty than the last. Evidence was no longer merely accumulating. It was taking shape, forming a structure no defense attorney could spin away without insulting the law itself. "Mr. Alvarez," he said one morning, his voice clipped with resolve, "the financial analysis is complete. The pattern is irrefutable. These were not personal expenses nor accidental transfers. They were systematic, coordinated." He paused, not because he doubted the facts, but because he understood their weight. And Clara's role, he continued, was exploited. She was documented as a beneficiary to disguise illicit income and to shield certain transactions from scrutiny. Clara was beside me at the kitchen table, stirring a mug of tea that had long since grown cold. Her hands moved mechanically, but her eyes were fixed on some invisible space between us. My grip on the phone tightened. "She had no knowledge of this," I said, the words hardening as they left me. "She won't be treated as a participant," the prosecutor replied. "That is clear from the records. She was used, and we will present it as such." Clara shut her eyes, as if absorbing a truth she had always suspected but had never dared to confront fully. The kind of knowledge that had lived at the edge of her awareness, too frightening to bring into focus. After the call ended, the kitchen grew painfully quiet. Clara didn't speak at first. She pressed her hands flat against the table, grounding herself. "I didn't understand the numbers," she whispered finally. "I didn't understand why there were always envelopes, why there were always sudden debts. I thought I was simply bad with money, that I was the problem." I shook my head. "You were never the problem. You were the cover." The truth sat between us like a stone placed on an old wound, heavy, undeniable, demanding to be felt. That afternoon, something unexpected broke the rhythm of testimony and paperwork. A soft knock echoed through the house. When I opened the door, a woman stood there, early 30s, perhaps, though her tired eyes made her seem older. She held herself with a strange mix of firmness and hesitation. "My name is Sophia," she said quietly. "I used to work with Adrian. Years ago." Clara came to the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Sophia swallowed before speaking again. "I heard what happened, and I need to say I'm sorry." Clara frowned, taken aback. "Sorry for what?" Sophia lowered her gaze, shame unraveling her composure. "I saw him yell at you once, in the parking garage behind the office. He pushed you against the car. You cried." I dashed. She blinked rapidly. "I should have called someone, or said something, but I didn't." Clara's breath caught. I saw the moment she remembered, the particular curl of fear, the cold metal of the car against her back. Sophia continued, her voice trembling. "Back then, I didn't want problems. I didn't want to get involved. I told myself it wasn't my place. But seeing everything now, knowing what you went through, I can't stay silent anymore." She took a steadying breath. "If the court needs my testimony, I'll give it. Not because it fixes anything, but because I should have done it years ago." Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she looked at Sophia with a complicated expression. Gratitude threaded with grief, forgiveness crossed with sorrow for the version of herself who had once stood alone. "Thank you," she whispered. When the door closed, Clara remained motionless for a long time. "So many people saw," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "and no one said anything." I touched her shoulder. "People often convince themselves they're helpless. But helplessness is just fear wearing a polite disguise." She nodded, though her expression stayed distant, as though she was sorting through a box of memories she had buried long ago, memories she now had no choice but to face. Later that evening, Mateo arrived with new documents, a stack thicker than a dictionary, thick enough that he set it down on the dining table with a quiet thud. He spread the papers out across the surface, transforming the table into an anatomy lesson of a life poisoned by secrets. Columns of names, dates, transfers, voice transcripts, messages from burner phones, diagrams of connections. The skeleton of an organization that had operated in the shadows for years now lay exposed under the glow of a simple ceiling lamp. Adrian has given up more than we expected, Matteo said. He named his mother as the one who managed the accounts and oversaw intimidation. He named accomplices who handled cash drop-offs. He admitted to staging financial emergencies to extract money from you, Gonzalo. I exhaled slowly, feeling something sharp twist inside me. I had suspected as much, small suspicions over the years, dismissed out of fear or denial. But hearing it confirmed, laid out so plainly, stung more deeply than I could have anticipated. Matteo's voice softened. None of this is your fault. Maybe not, I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. But I helped fund the stage upon which my daughter suffered. Clara reached across the table, resting her hand atop mine. Dad, she said gently, you didn't know? And even if you had known something was wrong, fear is powerful. It blinds us in different ways. You were trying to help. I know that. There was something new in her tone, a steadiness, a clarity I had not heard in years. It was the voice of someone no longer apologizing for having survived. Matteo cleared his throat. There's more. The court has approved protective measures. A restraining order has been issued against both Adrian and Marjorie. Additional monitoring will be in place. If either of them attempts to contact you in any way, it will be considered a violation with immediate legal consequences. Clara released a breath that sounded as if it had been trapped in her lungs for years. So, I'm safe? She asked, almost childlike, as if safety was an unfamiliar country she wasn't yet sure she had permission to enter. For now, Matteo replied. You are safer than you have been in a very long time. That night, after Matteo left, I found Clara in the living room holding an old photo, one taken on her wedding day. In the picture, she stood in sunlight, her smile bright and hopeful, untouched by the long, bitter winter that would follow. She ran her thumb slowly along the edge of the frame. I lied to myself, she whispered. For years, I told myself that things weren't as bad as they felt, that I was exaggerating, that if I changed something, if I behaved differently, tried harder, he would stop. She swallowed. But I survived my own lie. And I don't know whether to mourn the years I lost or celebrate the fact that I'm still here. I sat beside her, slipping an arm gently around her shoulders. Both, I said softly. Mourn what was taken. Celebrate what remains. And remember this. You are living your truth now. That is a victory no one can take from you. She leaned into me, the photo still in her hands, her breathing steady. Outside, the streetlights flickered, casting shifting patterns across the windows, as if the world was adjusting its gaze, learning to see us clearly at last. Inside, something else shifted too. The last pieces of the mask her abusers had worn were falling away, cracking under the weight of evidence and the force of a truth too long denied. Truth was no longer a whisper. It had become a force. The day the trial date was announced, the air in our home shifted, not lighter, not heavier, but sharpened with purpose. As though time itself had straightened its spine and stepped forward. I felt it before Clara said a word. She stood by the window with her phone in hand, sunlight outlining her profile like a quiet vigil. She read the prosecutor's message once, then again, slower, as if each sentence needed to settle into her bones before she could believe it. Finally, she lowered the phone. A long, uneven breath escaped her. So it's happening, she whispered. Yes, I said. It's happening. The certainty of that moment felt both monumental and fragile, like watching the first stone placed on a bridge that had once seemed impossible to build. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the world around us changed in ways small but unmistakably profound. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now nodded with something like respect, or perhaps contrition. The grocery clerk, a shy young woman who had rarely spoken more than a greeting, began slipping Clara small discounts she never asked for. A reduced price on fruit, a coupon she happened to find, a smile that carried unspoken solidarity. Even the mailman, who had witnessed more of our life unfolding on the front porch than we ever realized, paused one morning as Clara accepted a stack of envelopes. He glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "You did the right thing," he murmured, barely above a whisper. Clara blinked, startled. Then, slowly, she nodded. Every gesture was another stitch mending a wound she once believed would never close. These were not grand acts of allyship, but small acknowledgments that together formed something like a safety net. But shadows persisted too. Anonymous messages appeared in her inbox, cruel words attempting to smear her character, accusing her of exaggeration, of vengeance, of trying to destroy a good family. Old acquaintances, who had once ignored her suffering or dismissed her concerns, resurfaced with opinions disguised as sympathy. And every so often, a car would slow as it passed our street, lingering just a moment too long. I documented everything. Dates, descriptions, license plates. Not out of fear, or not only fear, but because vigilance had become its own form of protection. Fear no longer froze us, but it still walked beside us. Mateo visited often. His regular presence steadied the rhythm of our days, grounding us in a process that felt overwhelming in scale. He walked us through each step of the legal labyrinth with patient clarity, translating judicial jargon into something human, something survivable. One evening, he arrived with another folder, thinner now, but heavier in a more decisive way. Inside were new interviews from former associates, final forensic accounting reports, and a set of audio files that laid Adrian's cruelty bare with haunting precision. The recordings were grainy, but the malice in his voice required no clarity. When Mateo finished playing the last file, he closed the laptop with deliberate care. "They won't be able to deny any of this," he said. "The structure has collapsed. Now all that remains is the judgment." Clara sat very still, fingers curled around a mug she wasn't drinking from. Her knuckles were white, but her gaze did not waver. "You'll have to testify," Mateo continued, his voice gentle. "I know," she said. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "And I will." Something in that moment shifted in her, as though a door inside her had finally opened and she had stepped through without looking back. The morning of the preliminary hearing, Clara stood before the mirror adjusting her jacket. She smoothed the fabric twice, then took a step back, examining her reflection with a quiet intensity. I watched from the doorway. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now fastening each button as if claiming ownership of her place in the world. "You look strong," I said. She met my eyes in the mirror. "I feel real," she replied. "More real than I have in years." We left the house in silence, not for lack of words, but because the weight of the day required a reverence beyond conversation. The drive to the courthouse felt both endless and strangely short. Clara sat upright beside me, hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring ahead with a focus that bordered on serene. When we arrived, reporters clustered at the courthouse steps, their cameras poised like watchful birds waiting for movement. Their voices rose in a chorus of questions as we approached. "Clara, do you have a statement? Do you feel safe testifying? Are you seeking maximum sentencing?" We walked past without looking up. The world could wait. Only truth mattered today. Inside the courthouse, the air buzzed with the energy of overlapping anxieties. Lawyers flipping through heavy folders, clerks rushing with papers, families clutching hope like a fragile offering. The faint scent of old wood and floor polish mixed with the quiet hum of whispered conversations. Clara and I took our seats on the long wooden bench. She did not shrink. She did not curl inward. She sat with her back straight, eyes fixed on the front of the room where the judge would soon enter. Her breathing was steady, deliberate. I studied her profile, the firmness of her jaw, the new calm that had replaced years of trembling uncertainty. This was not the Clara who had once flinched at sudden movements, who apologized for imagined faults, who believed herself incapable of being believed. This was a woman reclaiming her life piece by piece. For the first time since this ordeal began, her fear did not speak first. Truth did, and truth has a sound unlike anything else. Steady, undeniable, patient as sunrise, breaking over everything that once hid in darkness. Clara inhaled slowly. The door at the front of the courtroom opened. Justice, at long last, stepped forward to meet her. The judge's ruling fell like a long-delayed breath, guilty on every count. As Adrian and Marjorie were led away, Clara reached for my hand. No tears, no trembling, only release. Later, in her new apartment's quiet light, she smiled soft, steady. "I'm living now," she said. And she was. We both were.